The first thing to know in managing business relationships is just like in personal relationships, they're not all created equal. In our personal lives, we have a range of relationship types. We have transactional relationships, like with the barista at Starbucks. They may know your name and your favorite drink, but that's about as far as it goes. Most of us have relationships with our barber or hairdresser or stylist. These folks get to know you and your personality, and over time they get to know how you like your hair. Then we have friends in our neighborhood, church, or clubs. These relationships may get a bit deeper. You may grow close enough with some of these folks to share your challenges and ambitions. You may even ask them for advice every once in a while. Then we have family members with which we live. Our lives are intertwined in all aspects, from chores around the house to planning for retirement. Our relationships grow and morph over time just as our circumstances change and we mature. As you look across this array of personal relationships, it's clear that your level of interaction, the things you discuss, the level of trust, and how you communicate differ quite a bit. For example, you probably wouldn't ask your barista or barber for advice about your long-term goals, nor would they expect you to comment about their business model or profitability. But the same thing holds true in business relationships. We have to shift from the one-size-fits-all mentality. We can't treat all suppliers, clients, or internal business units the same. So if your initial reaction is to resist that last comment, let me ask you this. Do you start with the same template for every outsourcing agreement? Would you struggle to detail how each business unit or client is different and list how your products and services are configured or customized to meet their particular needs? Is the first step in building a new account team or governance team to see who's available rather than who has a skill set that matches the needs of the deal's intent and required relationship? If you said yes to any of these questions, then you may still struggle with the one-size-fits-all mentality. So how do we break out of this? How do we know what type of relationship we should have so that we can align our priorities, behaviors, and expectations with our counterparts? Well, that's what we're going to cover in the rest of the course. But first, let's answer the question, why do we care? And let's start building a business case for relationship management. From an enterprise perspective, this is what business executives want. Sure, they want to continue to reduce the cost of service delivery, but the survey also highlights that they want to add more value to the business through access to better data, digitized solutions, and better, more outcome-based use of their providers. To me, this demonstrates an appreciation for the business service supply chain because it requires a good understanding of the needs of internal business units and acknowledges that service providers should play an increasingly important role in meeting those needs. But a critical success factor to this working is good relationship management up and down the chain. Right now, however, there's a lack of collaborative relationships with most service providers. Buyer executives rated only 1 in 5 of their key supplier relationships as collaborative. And I would argue that the relationships between most business service functions and their internal business units isn't much better. So until we improve our relationship management capability, we're not going to accomplish these goals. So if we buy into the premise that relationship management is a needed capability, how exactly do we build or teach this capability? I mean, isn't relationship management a soft skill? Well, yes it is, but that doesn't mean that there's no structure to it. The myth was that the skills required to be a good leader or to be a good salesperson were innate and couldn't be taught. But I can tell you firsthand that the Army takes leadership training very seriously and believes otherwise. We also know that every major corporation has adopted a sales methodology and teaches a structured approach to their salespeople before putting them in front of prospects. So even though there's an element of art to leadership and sales, there's a whole lot of science and structure to it as well. And the same goes for relationship management. The focus of this video is to talk about the relationship spectrum, which is the first component in the relationship management framework. It's the best tool I know of to break us out of the all relationships are created equal mentality and provide a meaningful vocabulary around the types of business relationships. Although this model came out of academia, I've used it for most of the past 2 decades. It's not rocket science, But just like any good model or framework, I've been amazed at how well it crystallizes what we should have known all along. We used to call this kind of realization the blinding flash of the obvious, or BFO for short. That realization, in this case, is that there are a range of business relationship types that are drastically different. The premise, as I've alluded, is that all business-to-business relationships fall somewhere on a spectrum. On the far left of the spectrum are relationships appropriate for the acquisition of the most basic commodities. And on the far right, relationships that are appropriate for a complex joint venture, a true legal partnership. As we learned early on in math class, there are infinite points on a continuum, and in this case, an infinite number of relationship types that are appropriate to a diverse set of circumstances. To make things manageable, the model breaks the spectrum into 4 types. From left to right, they're transactional, value-added, specialized, and unique. I'll get into the definitions shortly, but let's use a food service analogy first. A transactional relationship is like walking into a fast food restaurant like a McDonald's or a Burger King. The value proposition is clearly getting a quick meal at a low cost. At the end of the day, there really isn't a lot that differentiates these burger joints. If I'm driving down the highway and I want something quick, I'll pull over into whichever one comes first. Moving to the right on the spectrum, think about chain restaurants like a Chili's or an Applebee's, TGI Fridays, and the like. A bit of an upgrade on the food. You pay more, but someone comes to your booth and takes your order. They have a larger menu selection and will even ask you how you want your burger prepared. You can relax for a bit and they keep the drinks coming. Next, let's think about a premium steakhouse like a Ruth's Chris. This is a much different dining experience. The quality of the food is much better and you're happy to pay more for it. The linen tablecloths are a stark contrast to the cold, hard plastic tables in McDonald's. Your waiter is a professional, very courteous, and provides great advice to help you select the perfect meal to meet your taste. You can get beef at any of the places that I've mentioned, but as you move from left to right, the quality of the beef and the dining experience improve significantly. Furthest right, think about a home-cooked meal by your mom on your birthday. There is no place else where you can get your favorite meal prepared exactly how you like it. You couldn't swap out your mom for someone else's and expect the same meal. That would be crazy. And the quality of the meal and the value you receive are invaluable. It's unique. We all know what to expect when we walk into any of these places I've mentioned. We know the level of quality, we understand the business model, we know what appeals to us about their value proposition. We know how we expect them to act, and we know how they expect us to act. But because our business-to-business relationships are not as well defined as a restaurant franchise, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and confusion is usually the result. Ideally, the sourcing and sales process leave us in perfect alignment when we close a deal. But even when that happens, buyers and providers are pulled in different directions by desires to cut cost or improve effectiveness on one side, and the need for incremental revenue or profitability on the other. So in our world, a transactional relationship is simply for the acquisition of commodity products and services. This accounts for 70 to 80% of supplier relationships in a supply chain. By definition, the only thing that differentiates one supplier from another or one product for another is price. All other attributes are essentially the same. These relationships are very easy to contract for and manage. From a sourcing perspective, we use an agreement with standard terms, and from a governance perspective, all we have to do is to make sure that the widgets were delivered on time and in the right quantity and price. We don't need to know how they made the widget, and they don't need to know how we intend to use it. In the outsourcing world, a relationship focused on labor arbitrage is a good example of this. This is a highly directive relationship where the buyer defines all of the requirements or specifications and the provider fulfills them. Value-added relationships provide some incremental, more valuable services in addition to the commodity being acquired. These relationships typically make up 15 to 20% of a supply chain. They are characterized by higher quality and reliability for the acquired products and services. In this case, the provider learns a little bit about the client organization and how the product or service is being used and is willing to provide a small level of customization or configuration to add that additional value. Contrary to the throw it over the wall mentality of a transactional relationship, this type of relationship requires some level of interaction between the two parties to customize or configure the solution. A good example of this would be a value-added reseller that not only provides a laptop that meets specifications, they also install a standard image on the hard drive. Things continue to shift as we move right on the spectrum, because a specialized relationship is appropriate for relationships that don't assume that the buyer knows how to do everything better than the supplier. In a transactional relationship, a buyer tells the provider what to do and how to do it. But at this level, the buyer tells the provider what, meaning their business requirements, but not how. That's where the collaboration comes into play. They're hiring the provider for their expertise and their capability. Since this type of relationship is collaborative, it requires a much deeper level of interaction, information sharing, and joint planning between the two parties. This type of relationship may only represent 5% of the supply chain. A good example of a specialized type of relationship are the more transformational outsourcing agreements that we see today. They require a tremendous amount of expertise and capability that the supplier brings to the table. And to the far right on the spectrum is the unique type of business relationship. Just like we can't replace our mom for someone else's mom, we can't swap out this type of business partner. This type of relationship is characterized by both parties bringing something unique to the table. A classic example is the joint venture between Canon and HP to invent the laser printer. HP joined their expertise around printers with Canon's intellectual property and laser technology to develop that first laser printer. One party could not have done it without the other. This type of relationship is characterized by a tightly integrated relationship with resources from both parties that operate as peers. This type of relationship is not typical in outsourcing or strategic supplier management, but it does happen occasionally. So hopefully this model makes it more obvious that business relationships are quite diverse and require very different management. At different points on the spectrum, the expectations, behaviors, and priorities the two parties have of each other change dramatically. As you move from left to right, integration, trust, and the ability to drive more value grow. But moving to the right is not always the right answer. No relationship type is better or worse than another type. All four of them have their place. The key is alignment. Without it, expectations aren't met, frustration sets in, mistrust develops, and communication breaks down. So now that you know a little bit more about this relationship spectrum model, don't forget that it also applies just as well to internal business relationships, because most business service functions struggle to get past the transactional or value-added stage to really collaborate and add value at the specialized level with those internal constituents. So to summarize, the relationship spectrum provides structure to our capability development efforts in this area. It helps us see more clearly the differences in relationship types and how we need to manage and behave. We also mentioned that alignment of the two parties is the first and most critical step in managing a relationship. If a provider is acting like they're in a specialized relationship and the buyer like they're in a transactional relationship, problems are guaranteed to creep in. So back to the point we made in the first video, we have to stay away from the one-size-fits-all mentality. And now that you have a model around the 4 different types of business relationships, make sure that your behaviors are consistent with the intent of that relationship. So what I'd like you to do is to take a few minutes to plot one of your relationships on the downloadable template that I'll provide. Describe the behaviors exhibited that support where you plotted that relationship on the spectrum, and then put another mark to indicate where you want the relationship to be and describe some of those new behaviors and characteristics that you would expect to be present when you got there.